The first hull broke atmosphere over the western range at 6 minutes past dawn, and the readout under my hand told me it was praying. I had run the saddle post for 11 years, alone for most of them, and I knew the difference between a ship that comes to land and a ship that comes to bless. This one came down in the second manner. It descended slow, nose up, broadside to the wind, with no regard for the mountains it was about to scrape, and along its belly ran a wash of pale gold light that pulsed in time with nothing I could measure. The signal it threw out was not a hail. It was a recitation, the same 40 seconds of layered tone repeated and repeated, a liturgy aimed at a planet they expected to be empty. I keyed the array, locked the descent vector, and watched the second hull come through the cloud deck behind the first, then the third. Then I stopped counting by hand and let the post count for me, because the cloud deck was filling the way a road fills with a procession, and the number that came back was not a number you announce out loud at 6 in the morning to a half-staffed watch. Sail, I said into the line. Wake the valley. Wake all of it. There was a pause down in Hollow Station, the kind of pause a young officer takes when she is deciding whether to believe the old man on the mountain. I did not have time to earn it. Count, she said. 41 hulls in atmosphere, more on the deck above. They're singing, Sail. They came back singing. That word did the work the number could not. I heard her chair move. I heard the soft chain of orders begin behind her, low and unhurried, the way we had drilled it so many times that hurry had been trained out of us. Hollow Station was the lowest rung of the eastern defense, a relay post tucked under granite, and even Hollow Station did not panic. That was the first thing the Velthun got wrong about us, though they had 80,000 years to learn it and learn nothing. They thought silence was absence. They thought a quiet sky was an empty one. I had a grandmother who used to say that the people who left us did not leave because we were weak. They left because we were not yet worth the trouble of keeping. She said it the way you say a thing you have decided never to forgive. I was a boy then, and I did not understand. Standing in the saddle that morning, watching the gold-bellied hulls come down to claim a world they had written off, I understood her completely, and I was glad she had lived long enough to see what we built on the ground she was buried under. The lead ship found the wide pan of the Morrow Flats and settled there, 80 kilometers out, where the old maps still marked a city that the ice had taken long before any of us were born. The Crusade had a memory of that city. I am certain of it. They came down exactly where their records told them a human settlement had once stood, as if they meant to plant their banner on our grave and call it consecrated ground. The hull opened along its spine, not a ramp but a slow unfolding, petals of dark metal peeling back, and out of it poured the first of the faithful. I will tell you what they were, because the screens did, and because I looked at them every hour for the next 2 days until I could have drawn them in the dark. They were tall, taller than us by a head and more, and they moved on 3 legs, arranged like the points of a tripod, which gave them a rolling, deliberate gait that never hurried and never stumbled. Their bodies were sheathed in plate the color of old bone, segmented at every joint, and over the plate they wore long mantles stitched with a script that glowed faintly gold, the same gold as the ships, the same gold as the song. Their heads were narrow and crested, eyeless across the front, with a band of sensory pits running back over the crown, and when they turned that band toward a thing, they considered it the way a priest considers an altar. In the foreclaws of each warrior rode a weapon I did not recognize and did not like, a long haft ending in a focusing crown, and at the head of the column walked one whose mantle dragged the dust, whose crest was bound in gold wire, and whose every gesture the others answered like a congregation. That was the one I marked first. The post tagged him as the command node, and I left the tag where it was, but in my own head I called him the celebrant, because that is what he was. He did not survey the flats the way a general surveys a battlefield. He raised his foreclaws to the 4 quarters of the sky, and the whole landed. Host went still, and the recitation that had been pouring from the ships poured now from 10,000 throats on the ground, and the Marrow Flats rang with it. They were not asking whether anyone was home. They were already certain. They had come to reconsecrate a tomb. Daved, Sail's voice, tighter now. Eastern Command has it. They want your read. You've watched more sky than anyone on the wall. My read is they think this is empty, I said. My read is they don't know what year it is. What do you mean? I mean their formation. Look at how they're standing. No screen, no overhead cover, no dispersal. They've grounded 41 hulls wing to wing in open country, and they're holding a service. You don't do that on a world you respect. You do that on a world you've already buried. I watched the celebrant lower his foreclaws, and the recitation cut off all at once, clean as a blade. They think they're the only weather this planet has seen in 80,000 years. And what do we do about it? I had asked myself that question 11 years running, alone on a cold mountain, watching a sky that never moved. I had asked it of the array, and the array had no opinion. I had asked it of the granite, and the granite had kept its own counsel. Now the question had a fleet under it, and I found that the answer had been sitting in me the whole time, patient as the mountain. We let them finish their prayer, I said. Then we answer it. Eastern Command did not move for the better part of an hour, and I want to be honest about why. Because the temptation when you tell a story like this is to make us sound like a closed fist that had only to open. We were not in a hurry, but we were not asleep either. We were measuring. The Crusade had grounded a host, yes, but a host is not a threat until you know what it carries. And the faithful carried things we had to read before we could weigh. So while the celebrant blessed the Morrow Flats, the planet looked at him the way a man looks at a stranger who has walked into his home and begun rearranging the furniture, quietly, completely, from every angle at once. The first hard reading came from the orbital tier, relayed down to my post because I had asked to stay in the loop, and no one had thought to deny an old scout his window. The Velthan ships were old. Not old the way a veteran is old, seasoned and sure, but old the way a relic is old, a design that had not changed because it had never needed to. Their drives bled radiation in a pattern our own ships had stopped using before my great-grandfather drew breath. Their hull alloys were strong, but strong the way stone is strong, brittle under the right shear. Their shielding sang on 3 frequencies, all of which we had cataloged, all of which we had stopped fearing a very long time ago. They're a museum, the orbital officer said, not unkindly. A devout one, but a museum. Don't say that to anyone who'll repeat it, I told her. A museum that can still burn a city is a city's problem. Understood. But David, they haven't upgraded. In 80,000 years, they have not changed a bolt. They came back expecting the same Earth they left. That was the thing that turned in my chest like a key. They expected the same Earth. They had spent however many lifetimes crossing the dark, and somewhere in their long memory was a snapshot of a world that could not answer them, and they had nursed that snapshot all the way home and never once asked whether the picture might have aged. It is the arrogance of the long-lived. They could not imagine that 80,000 years, which to them was a recitation, a chapter, a pause between hymns, was to us 40,000 lifetimes of remembering exactly who had walked away and left us to the ice. The celebrant's host finished its service as the sun cleared the eastern peaks, and then they did the thing that ended any argument about their intent. They began to build, not a camp, a shrine. Out of the lead hull came great curved spars of the bone-colored metal, and the warriors raised them in a ring on the flats. And within the ring, they set a tall fluted column that caught the morning light and threw it back gold. I watched them work through the array, and I felt the back of my neck go cold, because I had seen that shape before, not in life, but in the deep records, in the buried catalog of the things that had been done to us in the years we do not speak of lightly. It was a claiming stone. They raised one on every world they took. They had raised one here before, in the city the ice ate, and now they had come to raise another on the bones of the first, and call the whole planet consecrated unto the closed hand. Sail, I said. Get me command. I know what they're doing. They're listening, Dave. Go. It's a right of reclamation. They held this world once and lost it, not to us, to time, to the cold. In their telling the ice didn't kill us, it purified us, swept the board clean for them to come back and take what was always theirs. That column is a deed. They finish it, the right closes, and in their law this planet belongs to the faithful again. I watched the column rise another length. They are not here to fight us. They don't believe there's anyone left to fight. They are here to sign a paper, a long quiet on the line. Then a voice I did not know, older than sails, level as a table. Scout. How long until the right closes? By the rate they're building, noon. They'll finish it by noon. Then we have until noon to decide what kind of people we are, the voice said. Stay on your glass, Scout. Tell us everything you see. I stayed on my glass. And what I saw, as the morning wore toward the hour they had chosen for their certainty, was a host of warriors building a monument to a victory they had not won, on a grave that was not empty, under a sky they had not bothered to check. They had 80,000 years to learn what we had become. They had until noon to find out. The first thing Earth did was let them keep building. That was a decision, and I want to be clear that it was a decision, because from the saddle it looked like patience, and from inside the right it must have looked like an empty world. Command could have put a round through that column in the first 10 minutes. The orbital tier had a firing solution before the celebrant raised the second spar. But a round through the column would have told the Crusade only that something on the surface could still throw stones. And that was not the message Earth had spent 80,000 years preparing to send. So we let them build, and we watched, and we readied the answer in a silence so complete the Velthan mistook it for absence right up until it wasn't. Here is what they could not see, because they never looked. Under the Morrow Flats, 40 meters down, ran a defense lattice older than my grandmother's grandmother, laid in the 1st century after the long cold when we crawled up out of the deep shelters and swore an oath as a species that we would never again be found wanting. It was not a weapon, not exactly. It was a net of sensors and emitters and shaped charges and harmonic resonators, a thing that could read the ground a host stood on and decide, with great precision, exactly how much of that ground would continue to exist. The Crusade had grounded their entire landing host on top of it. They had raised their claiming stone in the dead center of it. They had done this because their records said the Morrow Flats were the safest open ground on the continent, and their records were 80,000 years out of date, and they trusted them anyway. They're standing on the oldest thing we own, I told Sale, and they think it's a graveyard. Command knows. Command laid it. Command's grandfather laid it. I watched the warriors haul another spar upright, devout and unhurried, beautiful in their way, terrible in their certainty. I almost feel for them. Don't, Sale said, and there was something hard in it that I had not heard from her before, the voice of a young officer learning in real time what her grandparents had carried. They came back to put a stone on our grave. Save your feeling for our own. She was right, and I knew she was right, and still I watched the celebrant move among his host with his mantle, dragging gold across the dust, and I thought, he believes this is a holy thing. That was the part that would not leave me. He was not a butcher. He was a believer, and a believer who has decided you do not exist is more dangerous than any butcher, because the butcher at least concedes you were alive. At 8:45, the Crusade did something that changed Command's posture from measuring to moving. A flight of their lighter craft lifted off the flats, 6 of them sleek and gold-bellied like the rest, and fanned out east and north, low and fast, the way you send scouts when you mean to expand a claim. One of them came toward the eastern range, toward us. Inbound, I said. One light hull, my vector low. They're surveying the claim. Hold your post, the older voice from command said. Let it look. So I held, and I let it look, and I watched a Velthun scout craft cross the last ridge before the saddle and fly directly over Hollow Station without the slightest change in course, because Hollow Station, from above, looks like a fold in the granite and nothing more. We do not build up. We learned not to, in the cold when anything above the snow line died. We build down and into and under, and our cities wear the mountains like coats, and a crusade that remembers an earth of glass towers and open streets flies over the greatest works our species ever made and sees a wilderness. The scout craft circled twice and turned back toward the flats, and as it banked I saw, through the array, the sensory band of the pilot sweep across the slope below my post, across the granite that hid a relay station, a barracks, a power tap drawing off the deep heat of the world itself, and find nothing it considered worth a second pass. It logged an empty mountain. It flew home to tell the celebrant the claim was clean. They surveyed us, I said, and I heard myself laugh low without joy. They flew over Hollow Station and surveyed an empty mountain. Good, Command said. Let the record say so. That was when I understood the shape of what Earth meant to do, and it was not the shape I had expected from 11 years of imagining this morning. I had always pictured the answer as a sudden thing, the sky tearing open, the host annihilated between one breath and the next, a demonstration of force so total it ended the question forever. That was the boy's version, the version that wants the abandoned child to scream. The real answer Earth was assembling was colder and far more deliberate. We were going to let the Crusade complete its own record. We were going to let them survey the empty mountain, raise the claiming stone, close the rite, declare the world theirs, and only then, with their certainty fully built and fully witnessed by their own faith, were we going to take it apart in front of them, slowly enough that every one of them understood exactly what they had walked into and exactly how long it had been waiting, not to gloat. We are past gloating. We were past it before I was born, to teach, so that the ones we let leave would carry home a lesson the Velthun had refused, to learn for 80,000 years that the dark places are not empty, that the quiet worlds are not weak, and that the ones you leave behind do not forget the shape of the foot that stepped on them. At 9, I watched the second claiming spar lock into the ring. At 3:30, the column at the center stood nearly complete now, and the gold script along its length had begun to pulse brighter, the rite gathering toward its close. The celebrant had taken his place at the foot of it, foreclaws raised, and the host had formed up around the ring in tiers, rank on rank, the whole landed crusade arranged like a choir around its anthem. They were magnificent and they were doomed, and they did not know which. Daved. Sail, quiet now. Commands moving people, real movement. Whatever they're going to do, it's close. What are they staging? They won't say. But the warship tier just went dark on our scopes, and the warship tier doesn't go dark unless it's about to come down. I felt that in my teeth. The warship tier. We do not fly our ships where they can be seen unless we want them seen, and we do not bring them low over a populated continent for a drill. If the tier was coming down, Then Command had decided the lesson was worth a sky full of hulls, and that meant the lesson was the whole point. How long, I asked. They're timing it to the right. They want him to finish. Of course they did. They wanted the celebrant to close his right, raise his foreclaws, declare the world reclaimed in the name of the closed hand. And they wanted his own host to hear the answer come down on top of the words while they were still warm in the air. There is a cruelty in that, and I would not pretend otherwise. But it is the cruelty of a people who were taught cruelty first and learned, slowly, painfully, across 40,000 lifetimes, to make their cruelty exact. We would not kill more than the lesson required. But the lesson required that they understand. And understanding is the most expensive thing you can ask of a believer. The sun climbed, the column burned brighter, the host sang. And 40 meters under the Morrow Flats, the oldest thing we owned woke up without a sound and began very quietly to count the feet standing on top of it. I stayed on my glass. I had promised Command I would tell them everything I saw, and so I watched the celebrant lower his foreclaws one final time, and I watched the gold script along the column flare to a steady, brilliant light, and I watched 10,000 Velthun warriors fall silent together in the moment their faith told them the world had become theirs again. For one breath, nothing happened. The flats lay still in gold under the high morning sun, the host frozen in their triumph, the claiming stone blazing at the center of a rite 80,000 years in the closing. Then the mountains opened their eyes. Between the third spar and the fourth, the Crusade made a discovery of their own, and it is worth telling because it is the first time I saw certainty crack in them, hours before the lattice ever lit. A work detert of perhaps 30 warriors had been sent out from the shrine to clear the ground at the western edge of the ring, where an old rise broke the flatness of the pan. Their records, I think, marked it as rubble. The slumped remains of the human city the ice had taken, picked over and harmless. They went at it with cutting tools, meaning to level the rise so the claiming ring would sit clean on consecrated ground. I watched them through the array. I watched the cutting tools bite into the rise and stop, and the warriors lean into them and the tools still stop, and a long pause spread through the detail as they realized that what they had taken for a heap of ancient rubble did not cut. It did not cut because it was not rubble. It was a buttress, one of 10,000 like it, sunk into the continent in the recovery to anchor the lattice against exactly the kind of shaped detonation we would later use on the Crusade's own line, and it had sat under a skin of windblown soil for so long that even our own maps drew it as terrain. The Velthun work detert had brought cutting tools rated to open a hull, and they could not scratch the foundation of a fence we had stopped thinking about as a structure, because it had simply become part of the ground. They found a buttress, I told Sale. West edge of the ring, their tools won't touch it. What are they doing about it? Calling for the priest, I said, because that was exactly what they did. A runner went back across the flats to the shrine, and the recitation faltered for the span it took the message to land. And then a knot of the gold-mantled faithful came out to look at the thing the rubble had turned out to be. They circled it. They put their sensory bands on it. And here is the part I have carried. They decided it was a relic. They decided that a thing too hard to cut, sunk into holy ground, must be a remnant of their own first claiming, a buttress laid by the faithful in the world's first age. And they blessed it, and they built their ring to honor it, and they went back to their right reassured. They could not let themselves see it for what it was. To see the buttress true, they would have had to ask who poured it, and to ask who poured it, they would have had to admit that the grave had hands. So they made it theirs instead. They folded the first hard evidence of a super-strong earth into their own faith and felt better for it, and I sat on my mountain and watched a host explain away its own death, because the truth was too large to fit inside a creed 80,000 years old. It happened again before noon, twice more. The second time, a flight of the host's heavier weapons opened up on the eastern rise, our rise, the saddle's own shoulder, not in anger but in ritual, a salute fired into the empty wilderness to mark the 4 quarters of the claim. The bolts struck the slope below Hollow Station, and the slope absorbed them, not shrugged them off in a flash of shielding, simply absorbed them, the way the granite absorbs a winter, because the granite over Hollow Station is not granite alone, but granite laced with the same patient architecture as everything else we own. And it took a salute meant to consecrate a wilderness and gave back nothing, not heat, not scar, not echo. The work detert nearest the strike turned and looked up at the unmarked mountain that had swallowed their fire, and I watched them look, and I watched them decide, again that holy ground does not burn, and go back to their work comforted by the very thing that should have sent them running for their ships. They keep doing it, I said. They keep finding us and praying it away. That's the whole tragedy of them, Command said. And it was the only time all morning I heard anything like sorrow in that level voice. We are not hidden, Scout. We were never hidden. We are standing in the open in the only language a planet can speak, and they have a faith that translates every word of it into their own. You can't warn a man who hears his God in everything you say. All you can do is finally speak in the one language no creed can mistranslate. The third time was the worst, and it was the celebrant himself. Near 11, with the column nearly closed, he left the shrine and walked out alone to the western buttress his faithful had blessed, and he put his foreclaw against it, and he held it there a long time. Through the array I could not read his face. They have no face to read, only that crested band, but I could read his stillness, and his stillness changed while his claw was on the stone. Something came up through that foreclaw and into him that the recitation could not cover. I think for one moment, alone at the edge of his ring with his hand on a foundation his tools could not cut, the celebrant came closer to the truth than any of his host. I think he felt in the cold mass of the buttress the weight of a hand that was not his and not ancient and not gone. I think he almost asked the question. Then he took his foreclaw off the stone and went back to his column and raised it the last length and did not ask, because a priest at the head of a crusade cannot afford the question, and the not asking is what killed the ones who died on the line a few hours later. He had a chance out there alone with his claw on our oldest work to turn his host around. He chose the right. I do not hate him for it. I have come to think it is the most human thing a thing so alien ever did. Stand with the truth under his hand and choose the comfort of the thing he had already decided. We have done it ourselves as a species in the bad years. The difference is that we lived long enough and remembered hard enough to stop. By the time he raised his foreclaws to close the rite at noon, the crusade had been shown the truth 3 times and had blessed it away 3 times. And so when the lattice finally lit and the warships finally came down, it was not to them a revelation, it was a betrayal. The holy ground they had consecrated had turned on them. That is what they will carry home, the ones we let leave. Not we found a super strong earth, but our God lied to us. And I am not sure which is the heavier thing to carry across 80,000 years. It began as light, and the light did not come from the sky. It came from the ground from 1,000 points across the Marrow Flats at once. Thin lines of pale blue tracing up out of the dust in a pattern that took my breath because it was a pattern geometric and exact, a grid laid out under the host's own feet that none of them had ever known was there. The lines rose and stood, a lattice of light 40 meters high, walling the entire crusade inside a cage they had built their shrine in the center of. The lattice did not touch them. It did not need to. It simply existed suddenly and completely where a heartbeat before there had been nothing but old ground. And the message of it was plain in any language ever spoken. You are not where you think you are. The host's silence broke. Through the array I watched 10,000 warriors turn at once, foreclaws coming up, weapons rising, the perfect choir dissolving into a thing that knew, finally, that it was surrounded. The celebrant alone did not turn. He stood at the foot of his blazing column with his crest bound in gold wire, and his sensory band swept slowly across the cage of light. And even at 80 kilometers I could read the thing that came over him, because it is the same in every living creature that has ever been wrong about something that mattered. He went still in a way that was not calm. They see it now, I said into the line. My voice did not sound like mine. Stay on your glass, Dave, the older voice. It's only the floor opening. The floor opening. That was Command's word for it. Dry as the flats, and it was exactly right. The lattice was not the answer. The lattice was the lid coming off the answer. Because as the host wheeled and the celebrant froze, the deep heat tap under the eastern range, the one whose power I had drawn on alone for 11 years to warm one old scout on one cold mountain, fed up through the granite, into Hollow Station and into the lattice and into the lattice's brothers. A chain of them I had never known ran the length of the continent, and the whole hidden architecture of the long cold oath lit up beneath the crusade, like a circuit finally closing after 80,000 years of waiting for a hand to press it. And then the warship tier came down. I have watched the sky my whole life. I have seen storms that took villages and auroras that ran from horizon to horizon and the slow-burning fall of dead satellites older than recorded history. I had never seen what came down over the Marrow Flats that morning, and I do not expect to see its equal again. They came through the cloud deck not as ships but as weather, as a second sky lowering itself onto the first, hulls kilometers long, dark and seamless and utterly without the gold the crusade loved, sliding into position over the flats with a silence that was worse than any thunder, because thunder at least is the sound of something spending itself, and these spent nothing. They simply arrived and held, and blotted out the sun in long bars of shadow that fell across the host like the bars of a cell. The Crusade's lighter craft scrambled. I will give them that. The 6 scouts that had surveyed the empty mountains an hour before clawed up off the flats and ran for the nearest seam, open sky, and the warship tier let them go 100 meters, 203, and then a single emitter on the underside of the lead hull woke, threw one pulse of light too fast to see, and the 6 scout craft were not destroyed so much as canceled, 6 small golds winking out against the great dark above them, gone between one instant and the next, with no fire and no wreckage worth the name. The host on the ground saw it, the celebrant saw it, and the recitation that had filled the morning did not start again. "He's hailing," Sales said. "The command node. He's broadcasting on every band he's got. Command's got it on the open channel. Dave, you'll want to hear this." They patched it through, and for the first time the voice of the celebrant came into the saddle, and it was not what I expected. It was beautiful. Their language ran in long falling tones, layered 3 and 4 deep, and even stripped of meaning it carried grief in it, the grief of a priest at an altar that has just spoken back. The translators chewed on it and gave us the bones. "We come to a world consecrated to the closed hand. We come by ancient right. The cold took this ground and the cold made it ours. Who answers? Who stands on holy ground? Show yourselves, that we may know what we have offended." That last line is the one I have kept. Show yourselves, that we may know what we have offended. Even surrounded, even with his scouts canceled out of the sky and his host caged in light, the celebrant could not yet conceive that the thing answering him was the very planet he had come to claim. He thought a ghost had stirred. He thought he had disturbed some custodian, some remnant, some keeper left behind to tend the grave. He could not make his mind hold the other shape, that the grave had never been a grave, that the people the cold was supposed to have purified had come up out of the deep and spent 80,000 years building the thing now standing over his head. So Earth showed him. Exactly that and nothing more, and that was the most frightening thing of all. The lead warship lowered a single light to the surface, not a weapon, a beam of plain communication, a wide cone of pale illumination that fell on the flats just outside the cage of the lattice. And where it touched the ground answered. The dust drew back. A section of the marrow, flats the size of a city block, sank, rotated, and rose again as a platform, and on the platform stood a structure that had been buried under the supposed graveyard. The whole time the Crusade was building their shrine on top of it. It was a hall, a low, broad fortress hall of the same seamless dark as the warships, its face graven with a single device, a human hand, open, palm out, the oldest sign we have, the sign that means we are still here and the sign that means stop, both at once, because to us they have always been the same word. The Crusade looked at the open hand rising out of the grave they had blessed, and I watched, through the array, the exact moment the celebrant's mind finally bent to take the true shape of what he faced. His foreclaws lowered. His crest dropped. The whole host behind him seemed to lean back as one body, the way a tide draws down the beach before it turns. "He understands," I said. "Not yet," Command said. "He understands he was wrong about the grave. He doesn't understand how wrong. Watch." From the open-handed hall came a voice, not translated for the Crusade's benefit. They had their own machines for that, and we let them work, because a lesson you have to decode yourself is a lesson that stays. The voice was human, a woman's, old and level and entirely without anger, and it spoke first in the Crusade's own falling tongue, badly, the way you speak a language you learned from records and never expected to use, and then in ours, for those of us listening on the wall. "You left us here to die," the voice said. "We remember. We kept the memory the way you keep a wound, so it would not heal wrong. You called the cold a purification. We called it the long murder, and we survived it. You have come back to bless a grave. There is no grave. There is only us, and we have been waiting, and we are not the children you abandoned. Look up. Look at what your absence made. Then put your weapons down, and we will let most of you go home to tell the rest." The Crusade did not put their weapons down. I had hoped they would. 11 years on a mountain teaches you to hope quietly and expect nothing, and so I was not surprised, but I had hoped, because I had heard the offer in the old woman's voice, and the offer had been real. "Most of you go home." That is not a threat dressed as mercy. That is mercy that has counted the cost and decided it can afford to be merciful, which is the only kind worth anything. Earth could have ended the entire host in the time it took the celebrant to decode the words. Earth chose to make an offer instead. And the Crusade, because they were believers, because a believer surrounded is a believer most certain of his faith, refused it. The celebrant raised his foreclaws a final time, and this time the gesture was not a blessing. The host answered. 10,000 weapons came up off the dust and leveled outward at the cage of light, at the open-handed hall, at the dark sky full of human hulls, and the gold script along every mantle flared at once, and the recitation came back, but changed now, faster, harder, a war rite where the blessing had been. They had decided that what surrounded them was not the planet's rightful owner, but a desecration, an infestation that had defiled holy ground, and that the proper answer to desecration is fire. "They're firing," Sale said flat. "All of them." "Command, they're firing." 10,000 focusing crowns lit gold and threw their light up at the warship tier, a storm of it, a sky full of golden lances stabbing into the dark hulls overhead. And for a moment the Morrow Flats were the brightest place on the continent, brighter than the sun, the whole host pouring out everything 80,000 years of devotion had armed them with. I have to tell you, it was a great deal. The Velthun were not weak. Their weapons could have leveled the glass city the Crusade remembered, could have cracked a moon, could have burned any world that met them with the strength of the earth they had abandoned. The hulls took it and did not notice. That is the part I need you to understand, because everything turns on it. The golden storm climbed and struck and broke against the underside of the warship tier and ran off it like rain off a roof. There was no shudder in the hulls, no flare of overloaded shielding, no answering volley to show the strike had been felt. The human ship simply hung there in the smoke of the Crusade's whole fury and absorbed it, the way the granite under my post absorbs a winter, the way the deep heat of the world absorbs everything we ever ask of it and never runs low. The host emptied itself against the sky for the better part of a minute, the most devout barrage I will ever see, and at the end of it the sky was exactly as it had been, and the only thing that had changed was that the Crusade now knew in their bodies that they had nothing. The recitation faltered. I heard it falter through the array, the war rite breaking up rank by rank as the warriors at the back lowered their weapons, and the warriors at the front kept firing into a sky that would not break until even the celebrant's foreclaws began very slightly to tremble. Now, Sale asked. I knew what she meant. Now do we end it? No, Command said. Now we show them the floor was never the answer either. The lattice of light around the host changed. The pale blue cage did not brighten or close in. It simply rotated its pattern, the geometry shifting under the host's feet, and where the new lines crossed, the ground spoke. Not everywhere. That was the mercy and the terror of it both. The shaped charges woven into the old defense lattice fired in a pattern as exact as a surgeon's hand. A ring of them around the outermost edge of the host, 40 meters down, lifting a wall of earth and fire and pulverized stone into a circle that hemmed the Crusade tighter without touching the bulk of them. It was a fence drawn in detonation. It said this far and the ground itself ends. It killed the warriors standing on the line and spared the 10,000 inside it, and it did this on purpose, with a precision that no panicked defender could ever manage, because we were not panicked and had not been for 80,000 years. The host recoiled into its own center. The claiming column at the heart of the ring, the shrine they had raised, blazed on in the middle of them, suddenly obscene, a monument to a deed in the middle of warriors who had just learned the deed was void. And the old woman's voice came again from the open-handed hall, still level, still without anger, and somehow that was the worst of it, that none of this cost us our calm. The offer stands, she said, most of you home, to tell the rest. We have shown you the sky, and we have shown you the ground. There is nothing left for us to show you except the inside of this, and you do not want to see the inside of this. Put them down. The celebrant turned from the column to the hall. Through the array I watched him take a step toward it, his mantle dragging gold through the churned dust, his crest low, and I let myself think, that he was going to do it, that the believer had finally met a thing larger than his belief and bent to it the way even the most faithful must bend to weather. I have replayed that step 100 times. I think part of him wanted to. I think the priest in him, the part that knelt to things greater than himself, recognized a greater thing at last and ached to kneel. But a believer's pride and a believer's faith wear the same face, and I could not tell, watching, which one took the next step. He raised one foreclaw, not to the hall, to the column, to the shrine, and the gold script along it answered him and began fast to gather light, too much light, the light folding in on itself, the way a thing gathers when it means to come apart and take the ground with it. I had seen energy build like that exactly once, in the deep records, in the chapter we do not read aloud. He was not going to surrender, and he was not going to fight, because he could no longer fight. He was going to consecrate the ground the only way left to him. He was going to make a relic of the whole host and the whole flats and call the crater holy. He's going to blow the column, I said. My hands were cold on the glass. It's not a shrine. It's a charge. He'd rather die holy than live wrong. We know, Command said. And the calm in that voice was the calm of people who had known for 80,000 years that it might come to exactly this. We've known since he raised it. Watch the hall, Scout. Watch what we built for a man too proud to be saved. The open-handed hall did not fire on the column. It reached for it. A field came off the face of the hall, off the graven palm itself, a wide, silent pressure that I felt even at the saddle as a kind of stillness in the air, the way a room goes quiet before someone speaks who must be obeyed. The field closed over the claiming column, where it stood at the center of the host, and the gathering light inside it stopped gathering. Not because the celebrant had relented. He had not. His foreclaw was still raised, still commanding the charge to bloom. The light simply could not bloom, because the field around it had taken hold of every part of the reaction at once and was holding it, patient and absolute. The way I have seen a strong man take a child's wrist and hold the small fist closed without crushing. It only holding, only waiting for the rage to spend itself, the column shook. The gold script ran wild along its length, and the light strained against the field, and the whole host fell back from the shrine that had been their pride, and was now a bomb that would not go off. I watched the celebrant stare at his own raised foreclaw, at the charge that would not answer, and I understood that we had taken from him the last thing he had. Not his army, not his ships, not his claim, but his death. He could not even die wholly. The planet he had come to bless would not permit him the dignity of his own destruction. It simply held his rage closed in its open hand and waited. That more than the warships, more than the lattice, more than the canceled scouts, is the moment I would show the Velthun if I could show them one moment, because it is the whole of us in a single image. They came expecting an empty grave, and met a power that could have unmade them in a breath, and that power chose instead to take their suicide away from them and make them live. There is no mercy harder than that. There is no strength that costs more to use. A weak people kills its enemies. A frightened people lets its enemies die. Only a people entirely sure of itself reaches into the heart of a host that just emptied its fury against the sky and gently, deliberately, refuses to let them off so easily. "Hold it," command said, and I realized the order was not to me. It was to the hall, to the woman with the level voice, to whatever crew rode the warships overhead. "Hold it. Hold his death closed." And they held it. The field did not waver. Across the flats, the host milled in a thing that was no longer a formation and not yet a surrender. 10,000 warriors who had fired everything and detonated nothing, and could not run and could not win and could not even fall on their own column, all of them looking now to the one figure at the center, the celebrant with his gold-bound crest and his foreclaw still raised over a charge the planet would not let him spend. He lowered the foreclaw. It was a small thing. At 80 kilometers through the array, it was almost nothing, one armored limb coming slowly down to the dust. But I had watched that limb rise to bless the morning and rise to call down war and rise to call down a holy death. And now I watched it come down empty, and I knew what it cost him, because I am an old man who has lowered his own raised hand more than once in a long life and learned each time that lowering it is harder than keeping it up. The celebrant lowered his foreclaw, and around him, in a slow wave that started near him and ran out to the edges of the host, the Crusade lowered their weapons to the churned and burning ground. The recitation did not come back. There was no rite for this. They had no hymn for the day the grave answered. "He stood them down," Sale said softly. "Dave, he's actually stood them down. He had nothing else," I said, but that was not entirely true, and I knew it even as I said it. He had one thing else. He could have kept his foreclaw raised and let his pride command a death the planet would only have gone on holding closed forever, an eternity of straining light in an open hand. He chose to come down instead. I will not call it wisdom. I think it was exhaustion and shame and the simple animal truth that a body cannot stay braced for its own end, past the point the end refuses to come. But he chose it, and the choosing mattered, because it meant the offer the old woman had made 3 times could finally be kept. The field over the column held a moment longer. Then, with the host disarmed and the celebrant's claw in the dust, the gathered light inside the claiming stone was not released and not detonated but undone, drawn out of the column in a long pale thread and dispersed up into the dark hulls overhead, dismantled the way you diffuse a charge you have decided no one needs to be killed by, bled off into ships large enough to swallow a sun's worth of fury and never warm. The column went dark. The shrine the Crusade had built across the whole morning stood on the flats as nothing now, a bone-colored ring around a dead spar, a monument to a deed that the planet had simply declined to recognize. "Stand by, Scout," command said. "We're not done. The hard part of mercy is the part where you keep your word." I did not understand that yet. I would. The warship tier rose. The kilometers-long hulls that had hung over the flats like a second sky lifted back into the cloud deck, slow and silent, withdrawing the shadow they had laid over the host, and the high morning sun came down clean again on 10,000 disarmed warriors and one celebrant on his 3 legs in the ash of his own war rite. The lattice of light around them dimmed but did not fall, a fence now instead of a cage, lower paler, a line drawn in the ground that said only "do not cross," not "you will die." The open-handed hall stayed risen, its graven palm catching the noon light, the oldest word we have held up plain over the host that had come to bless our grave. We are still here, and stop in the same breath, because to us they have always been one word. And the old woman's voice came one last time across the flats, and this time it was not an offer, because the time for offers had passed when the celebrant lowered his claw. This time it was the keeping of the word. Go home, she said. Take your dead, take your ships. Take the memory of this noon and carry it to whatever you pray to, and tell it what you found where you expected a grave. We will not follow you. We do not want your worlds. We never did. We only wanted to be left alone, and you would not, and now you know the price of not leaving us alone. And the price is that you learn we were here the whole time, stronger than you, and we let you live. Go home and remember which of us showed mercy. It was not the faithful. It would be a cleaner story if the whole host had come down with the celebrant's claw. It did not. I had turned half my attention to the lead hull and the silent shrine when Sale's voice came up sharp on the line, and sharpness was rare in her now, a thing she spent only when it was earned. Daved, movement on the south arc of the ring. A wedge of them isn't standing down. They've reformed. I swung the array. She was right. Where most of the host had let their weapons fall to the churned dust, a knot of perhaps 400 warriors near the southern edge of the lattice had pulled themselves into a tight wedge around a second figure I had not marked before. Shorter than the celebrant, broader through the plate, his mantle not the priest's gold but a darker, duller bronze, and where the celebrant's crest was bound in wire, this one's was bound in something that looked, even at distance, like the dried remains of a hand, not a Velthun hand. The translators chewed on the insignia and gave us a word that came back as something between champion and zealot, an executioner, a war office the priesthood kept for the days when blessing failed and only blood would close a rite. That's their hard core, I said. The celebrant stood down the faithful. This one commands the fanatics. He doesn't answer to the priest. He answers to the hand. The wedge did not fire. They had seen what firing bought. Instead, they did the one thing the lattice had not been laid to stop, because no one who laid it 80,000 years ago had imagined an enemy this committed to a single point. They charged. 400 warriors broke from the disarmed host in a dead run for the one gap in the fence of light, the passage the hall had opened so the Crusade could carry out their dead, and they ran for it three-legged and fast and silent, the bronze zealot at the point of the wedge, his weapon up, aiming not at the warships, not at the hall, but at the open-handed face of the hall itself, at the graven palm, as if they could unmake the lesson by defacing the sign that carried it. They're going for the hall, I said. Command. The south gap, they're going to reach the hall. We see them, scout. Command unhurried, and I will never stop marveling at the unhurry of it. The hall can hold a charge of a sun. It will not notice 400 infantry. Watch the gap. Watch what closes it. The gap closed, not with fire. The hall withdrew the passage it had opened, the fence of light running shut across the running wedge's path, and where the warriors at the point of the charge met the line did to them what a line of that kind does. It did not burn them and did not crush them, it simply held, an absolute wall of refusal, and the wedge folded against it the way a wave folds against a cliff, the front ranks stopping dead, and the ranks behind driving into them, 400 warriors compressed in an instant against a fence that would not yield a centimeter. The bronze zealot reached the light and put his weapon's focusing crown against it and fired at point-blank range, the whole fury of it, and the light drank the shot and did not flicker, and I watched through the array, the exact moment the zealot understood that he was not assaulting a fortress. He was a man beating his fists on a closed hand. He still won't stop, Sale said. He's reforming them again. He's going to run them at it until they're gone. Then he'll be gone, Command said. But the offer was made to the host, and the host will see whether the offer holds even for the ones too proud to take it. Hold the line. Do not fire on the wedge. Let them spend themselves on it. That was the cruelest patience of the whole day, and I want to set it down honestly because it would be easy to leave out. Earth did not kill the zealot's wedge. Earth let them kill themselves against a wall that would not be moved, charge after charge, 400 dwindling to 3 to 2, the bronze champion driving the survivors into the light again and again while the rest of the disarmed host stood in the ash and watched their own fanatics break apart on a fence the planet did not even bother to make lethal. It would have been kinder to burn them. It would have been weaker too, because every warrior in that host who had lowered his weapon was learning, in real time, watching the wedge shatter and reform and shatter, the precise and unbearable truth of what the old woman's voice had told them. That Earth could hold them all closed in its hand as easily as it held the column, that their fury was not refused out of weakness but out of a strength so complete it could afford to let them choose, and that the only ones dying on the Morrow Flats that noon were the ones who chose it. The bronze zealot made his last charge alone. His wedge was gone, not slaughtered, broken, scattered back into the disarmed host or dead against the light, and he came at the closed fence by himself, three-legged, his dark mantle in rags, his crested head low, and he put himself against the wall one final time with everything he had left, and the wall held, and he slid down it to the churned ground and did not rise. The haul did not finish him. That was the answer to a question I had not known I was asking. A weaker people would have put a round through him where he lay, to be sure, to be safe, to be satisfied. The haul opened a narrow passage in the light beside his fallen body, toward the host, toward his own people, and waited. And after a long moment, 2 warriors from the disarmed Crusade came slowly across the ash and lifted their broken champion between them and carried him back through the gap to the lead hull, and the gap closed gently behind them. We let them keep their zealot. We let them keep even the one who had spat on our mercy and run at our face. That is not softness. I have heard men call it softness, and those men have never had to be that strong. It is the opposite of softness. It is the discipline of a people who learned, across 80,000 years, that the measure of your strength is not how many of your enemies you kill, but how many you can afford to spare. It's done on the South Arc. I told Sale, my voice was steady now. The weeping would come later, alone when the watch let me. The fanatics are spent. He carried home the lesson the hard way. And the celebrant? I swung the array back to the center, to the priest with his gold-bound crest, standing in the ash of his shrine, and I found that he had not moved through the whole of the zealot's charge. He had stood and watched his own fanatics break on the closed hand, and his sensory band was turned toward them. And whatever passed through him as he watched, it bent his crest lower than the warships had, lower than the lattice, lower than his own dead death. The ones who fought for him had taught him the last of it. He had come to bless a grave, and the grave had refused his blessing, refused his war, refused his suicide, and now refused even to be cruel to the ones who hated it most. And there was nothing left in any right he knew to answer a thing like that. He turned toward the hall, and this time he did not raise a claw at all. The thing I have not told you yet is what was happening over our heads the whole time the flats burned, because I did not know it myself until the orbital officer put it on my screen, and when she did, I had to sit a moment before I could speak. The 41 hulls on the Morrow Flats were not the Crusade. They were the vanguard of it. While the celebrant blessed the flats and the zealot broke on the closed hand, the bulk of the faithful's fleet had been holding above the cloud deck. Above even the human warship tier, a great devout armada strung out along its approach lane and waiting for the right to close before it descended to claim what the right had won. Hundreds of hulls. The vanguard we faced on the ground was a tenth of what hung in the dark, and the moment the lattice lit and the warships came down and the canceled scouts winked out, the armada above stopped waiting and began, all of it, to come. Daved, the orbital officer said, and even she, who had narrated the canceling of the scouts like a woman reading a weather report, had something new in her voice. You should see what they're bringing. The vanguard was the priests. This is the war. She fed it to my screen. The armada coming down through the high dark was not the museum the vanguard had been. These hulls were larger, harder, their gold burned off in favor of a scarred and functional black, their weapon mounts heavy and many, ships built not to bless a world, but to break one that fought back. The faithful had not come unprepared. They had come with a priesthood to perform the rite and a war fleet to enforce it, and the war fleet had just watched the rite end in fire and was descending now, in earnest, in numbers, with the cold certainty of professionals who had finally found the fight they were built for. How many? I asked. Enough to take a world that could be taken. A pause. This isn't one of those. What happened next is the part of the morning I least expected and most needed to see, because up until then everything Earth had shown had been the surface, the lattice in the ground, the hall in the grave, the warships in the low sky. Those were the works of the recovery, the things we built in the first long centuries after the cold, the fence and the fortress and the fleet that walked the wall. They were 80,000 years old in their oldest bones, and they were terrifying, and they were, I understood as I watched the armada come, the least of what we had, because the recovery did not stop when the fence was laid. We did not build a wall and sit behind it for 80,000 years. We built and kept building quietly into the dark. Against the day the ones who left us came back to see whether the grave had stayed a grave. The orbital tier woke. I have called the lattice the oldest thing we own and the warships the works of the recovery, and both are true, but the orbital tier was neither old nor a work of the recovery. It was new. It was the thing we had spent the most recent 10,000 years on, the thing my own generation helped to hull, the answer we built once we understood that a fence and a fleet were enough to win a war on the ground, but not enough to make the lesson stick in the sky. And when the armada of the faithful's war fleet came down through the high dark expecting to find a planet that had spent its strength on the vanguard, the orbital tier was waiting for them. And it had been waiting, fully manned and fully armed, since the first wrong recitation came over my array at 6 minutes past dawn. It did not look like ships. That is the thing I keep returning to. The Crusade's war fleet was ships, recognizable, hulls and engines and weapon mounts, the grammar of war they had carried unchanged across 80,000 years. What rose to meet them in the high dark was not in that grammar at all. It was structure, rings and platforms and long graven spars of the seamless black, an architecture of defense that girdled the planet above the cloud deck and had hung there silent and dark through the entire morning, so that the Armada's own scouts had flown their approach lane straight through it and logged empty sky. We do not fly our ships where they can be seen unless we want them seen. We do not light our orbital tier until the moment the lighting is the lesson. And the moment the war fleet committed to its descent, certain the surface was the whole of the fight, the architecture they had passed through unlit came alive around and behind and above them, and they understood, far too late, that they had not been approaching a planet. They had been admitted into a closing hand. The orbital tier did not fire first. It hailed. One message on every band the Armada carried, in the Crusade's own falling tongue, and the orbital officer let me hear the bones of it. You have passed our outer line. It is behind you now. Your vanguard is disarmed on the ground, and your priest has lowered his claw. We are the line you did not see, and there are more behind us that you will never see unless you force us to show you. Turn your fleet. Climb back through the dark you came down. We will let you go because the ones we let go are the lesson. The ones we do not let go are only a number, and we are tired of numbers. Choose. The war fleet did not turn. I think they could not. A war fleet that has crossed 80,000 years to enforce a right does not climb back into the dark because a voice told it the grave was strong. Not on the first hail. Not from professionals who had never lost. They came on, and they brought their weapons to bear on the orbital tier, and the high dark above the cloud deck lit up with the same gold fury the host had thrown at the warships, scaled now to a fleet, an entire armada pouring its strength into the seamless black architecture that had risen around it. And the orbital tier did what the warships had done over the flats. It took the fury and did not break. But where the warships had only absorbed, only endured, only hung silent, and let the host learn that its strength was nothing, the orbital tier was not built to endure. It was built to answer. And when the war fleet's barrage broke against it and ran off it and changed nothing, the architecture in the high dark, the rings and the platforms and the long graven spars, did the thing my generation had spent 10,000 years learning how to do without cruelty and with absolute finality. It closed. There was a moment in the high dark before the tier closed when the war fleet of the faithful nearly did the one thing that would have forced our hand past the point of mercy, and I want to set it down because it is the closest the whole morning came to ending the way the Velthun thought it would. When the orbital tier lit around them and the first hail told them to turn, the war fleet's commander, a different mind than the celebrant, a soldier where the priest was a believer, did not waste his strength on the seamless black the way the host had wasted theirs on the warships. He had watched the vanguard's fury break against the human hulls, and he had drawn the right lesson from it, the soldier's lesson, that he could not punch through. So he did not try. Instead, he turned his whole armada downward, drives full, and dove for the cloud deck, meaning to put his hundreds of war hulls into the atmosphere over a populated continent where, he reasoned, a planet that had been so careful not to kill its disarmed vanguard would not dare to fight at full strength for fear of cracking the very world it was defending. It was a good plan. It was the plan of a commander who understood that our restraint was real and meant to use it against us, to wedge his fleet in behind our own mercy where we could not bring our worst to bear. For a long 10 seconds I thought it might even work, because the armada gathered speed and the cloud deck rushed up and the orbital tier did not fire, and I heard myself say, "They're diving, command. They're going to get inside the cloud deck." "Let them come down," command said. "Let them learn the last thing." The war fleet hit the cloud deck, and the cloud deck was not cloud. I had looked at that deck every day for 11 years and called it weather. It was not weather, or not only weather. The recovery had seeded the high atmosphere of the whole world with a layer my generation finished, a medium that hangs in the upper air looking for all the world like an ordinary deck of cloud, and is in truth the outermost skin of the closed hand, the part that catches anything trying to do exactly what the war fleet was trying to do, slip under our strength by getting close to our ground. The armada drove into it, expecting open sky beneath, expecting the inside of our guard, expecting a continent they could hold hostage. What they found was that the deck closed around their hulls the way water closes around a thrown stone, gently and totally, drives biting on a medium that simply would not let them descend, hundreds of war hulls slowing and stopping and hanging suspended in what they had. Taken for cloud, lower than the tier now, deeper inside our reach than any enemy had come in 80,000 years, and more helpless for it, not less. The commander understood. I will give him that to the end. He understood, in the moment his fleet stuck fast in the false cloud, that he had not slipped behind our mercy. He had walked his entire armada into the deepest part of the hand, the part closest to the ground, the part we had built precisely for the soldier clever enough to try what he had tried. He had outthought the priest and the host and every warrior who threw fury at the warships, and his cleverness had carried him not around our strength but into the center of it. He did not order his fleet to fire from inside the deck. There would have been no point, and he was not a fool. He held his hundreds of hulls motionless in the false cloud over our continent, and he sent one last transmission, and the orbital officer let me hear it, because she said I had earned the whole of the morning by then. It came through in the Crusade's falling tongue, and the translators gave us the bones, and the bones were not a threat and not a prayer. They were a soldier's question, asked of an enemy he had finally measured. "How long have you been able to do this?" the commander said. And the old woman's voice answered him, from the open-handed hull far below, level as it had been all morning. "Since before your faith had a name for us," she said. "We did not build this for you. We built it for whoever came back, and you are only the first in a long time. Climb out of the cloud, Commander. Take your fleet home. And tell whoever sent you that the dead world keeps a longer memory than the living one, and it is done being patient with visitors." The cloud deck opened upward. Not downward, it would never open downward for them, not toward our ground, but upward. A road back into the high dark, the way the tier had opened a road for the rest, and the war fleet of the faithful, hundreds of hulls strong, the iron the priesthood had brought to enforce its right, climbed back up out of the false cloud it had dived into, past the orbital tier that had let it pass once already, up into the dark, beaten not by fire but by the simple, total demonstration that there was no part of our sky, high or low, near or far, that we did not already hold in an open hand we had simply chosen, all morning, not to close. That was the last reading my array took of the Crusade as a fighting force, the war fleet rising out of the cloud it had. Thought to hide in, the cleverest move it had carried home from 80,000 years, emptying into the same lesson as the host's blind fury and the zealot's blind faith. There is no way under us. There is no way around us. There is no part of this world we forgot to defend while we were busy seeming dead. We thought of you. We thought of all of you, every kind of you, the believer and the fanatic and the clever soldier, and we built the answer to each of you, and we let it sit in the dark for 80,000 years. And the only thing any of you got to choose, in the end, was whether you climbed home knowing it or died not understanding it at all. I did not see the closing the way you would imagine it. There was no great flash, no fire filling the dark, no fleet erased in a single hammer stroke. That is the boys' version again, and the boys' version is always wrong about us. What I saw on the orbital officer's feed was quieter and far worse for the watching. The rings of the tier rotated. The platforms shifted their geometry the way the lattice had shifted under the host's feet, and where the new lines of the architecture crossed, the space the warfleet occupied began simply to stop being space the warfleet could use. Their drives, which bled radiation in a pattern we had cataloged before my great-grandfather drew breath, found themselves pushing against a medium that had been quietly seeded to refuse them. Their weapons, which had broken against the seamless black, found their focusing crowns dimming as the tier reached into the reaction and held it the way the hull had held the column, closed in an open hand. Their formation, hundreds of hulls strong, came apart not in fire but in helplessness, ships drifting, drives guttering, the whole proud war fleet of the faithful slowing in the high dark like a hand of cards laid face down one by one. "They can't run," the orbital officer said. "We've taken the dark from them. They can fall or they can hold, but they can't run, and we are not going to make them fall. Watch." We did not make them fall. The tier held the armada motionless above the cloud deck, drives dead, weapons dimmed, hundreds of war hulls suspended in a sky they had thought to descend through and own. And it held them there in plain sight of the surface, in the high noon light, where every disarmed warrior on the Marrow Flats could look up through the thinning cloud and see their war fleet, the iron certainty behind the priesthood, hanging dead and silent in the closed hand of the planet they had come to bless. The Crusade had come singing. Now the whole of it, vanguard and priesthood and warfleet, was silent together, and the silence stretched from the ash of the flats to the high dark, and the only sound on any band Earth bothered to broadcast was the old woman's voice, level without anger, keeping its word. "We told you to turn," she said. "You did not. We told you we were tired of numbers. You made yourselves a number anyway. So here is the last of the lesson, and it is the part your priests will least want to carry home. We are not going to fall on you. We are going to let you go." I did not understand it, and then I did, and when I did, I had to put the array down and breathe. The tier opened. The closed hand in the high dark unclosed, ring by ring, platform by platform, the seamless black drawing back its refusal, and the Warfleet's drives caught again, and their dimmed weapons warmed, and the dark they had been denied opened above them like a road. Earth had taken the entire armada into its fist, held it motionless and helpless in front of its own disarmed vanguard, demonstrated past any possibility of doubt that it could end every hull in the high dark whenever it chose, and then it let them go, not beaten, released. With their ships intact and their weapons live, and the dark open above them, free to climb back the way they had come, free to run home with the lesson burning in them, free, above all, to tell the rest exactly what they had found where they expected a grave. That's the whole of it, the orbital officer said quietly. That's the lesson the recovery built. Anyone can win a war. We spent 80,000 years learning how to win one and let the loser live to say so. A dead enemy is a story their children make into a reason to come back. A spared enemy is a warning their children make into a reason to stay home. We are not building a graveyard up here, Scout. We are building a reputation. The Warfleet climbed. I watched it on the feed, hundreds of scarred black hulls drawing up off the cloud deck and back into the high dark drives live, weapons live, free and beaten in the same breath, and not one of them fired a parting shot, because they had learned in the closing what a parting shot would buy, and they had learned it in their bodies, which is the only place a believer ever truly learns anything. They climbed past the orbital tier that had held them, and the tier let them pass, and they climbed past the outer line they had flown through unseeing at dawn, and the outer line let them pass, and they went up into the dark they had crossed to reach us, carrying home the one thing 80,000 years had failed to teach them, and a single noon had finally driven in. They took 3 hours to leave, and Earth watched every minute of it without firing a shot. I stayed on my glass the whole time, because Command had asked me to, and because I could not have looked away if they had ordered me to. The Crusade gathered their dead off the line where the ring of charges had drawn the boundary of the world. And there were dead, I will not pretend otherwise, the warriors who had stood where the ground ended when the floor opened, the warriors the lattice had killed to teach the lattice's lesson. Earth did not gloat over them, and Earth did not pretend they were not there. The hall opened a gap in the fence of light, a single passage, and through it the faithful carried their fallen back to the lead hull on biers of their own gold, three-legged and slow, their war rites silenced, their claiming stone dead behind them, and the human warships hung in the high cloud and let them grieve. That was deliberate, too. I have thought about it for a long time since. We could have made them leave the dead. We could have made them run. Instead, we held the fence open and let a defeated host bury its grief with dignity in front of us, and I think that was the last and hardest piece of the lesson. The piece even the warships were only the setup for. Because a people who lets its enemy mourn is a people that has nothing left to prove, and the Velthun, who had come 80,000 years to prove they still owned us, watched a planet stronger than their entire crusade stand quietly aside so they could carry their dead. And there is no sermon in any faith that could have taught them what that silence taught. The celebrant was the last to board. I watched him stand a long time at the foot of the unfolding petals of the lead hull, his mantle gray now with ash, his gold-bound crest dull, his sensory band turned not toward the empty mountains he had surveyed at dawn, but up at the cloud deck where the human hulls waited, and then down at the open-handed hall risen out of the grave he had come to bless. He stood and he looked, and I let myself believe that somewhere behind that crested, eyeless face the true size of the morning was finally landing on him, settling into him the way the cold settles into granite, slow and total and permanent. He had crossed the dark certain. He would cross it home, knowing. That was the whole of what Earth wanted from him, and the whole of what 80,000 years had armed us to deliver. Before he turned, he did one last thing, and the array caught it, and I have never decided whether it was surrender or prayer. He walked from the foot of his hull back across the ash to the western buttress, the one his faithful had blessed, the one his own foreclaw had rested on near 11, while the truth came up through the stone and he refused it. He stood over it a second time, and this time, with his shrine dead and his host disarmed and his war fleet beaten in the high dark, he lowered himself on his 3 legs until his crested head was level with the foundation his tools could not cut, and he held there, motionless, the way I imagine a man kneels at a grave that has turned out to hold someone he wronged. The translators caught nothing. He made no sound any band could read. But I understood the shape of it, because I had watched him bless that stone away once already, and I knew what it was to come back to a thing you had refused and finally let it be true. He had asked the question at last. He had asked it of a buttress sunk in the ground 80,000 years ago by hands he had spent his whole faith pretending did not exist. And the buttress, like the granite, like the deep heat, like all of us, kept its own counsel and gave him no comfort and no absolution, only the cold fact of itself, which was answer enough. Then he turned and went up into his ship, and the petals folded over him, and the gold went out of the marrow flats for the last time. The hulls lifted at noon, their noon, the hour they had chosen for their certainty, and I do not think Command timed it that way by accident, because nothing Command did that day was an accident. 41 ships rose off the flats in the order they had come, slow and broadside and devout no longer, climbing through the human warships that parted to let them pass and closed again behind them like a door. The recitation did not return. They left in silence, which for a people who had arrived singing was the loudest thing they could possibly have done. I watched them dwindle and gutter and gone, up past the cloud deck, up past the warship tier, up into the dark they had spent so long crossing to reach a world that did not want them and did not need them and had been waiting all the same. When the last warhull was off the feed and the last Vanguard ship was off my scope, I sat for a long time in the saddle, and I thought about my grandmother, and I thought about the fence the deep shelter people laid in the first century after the cold, and I thought about the orbital tier my own hands had helped to hull, and I understood that I had watched, in a single morning, the whole length of us, the oldest fence in the newest ring, 80,000 years of one people building toward one promise and keeping it without cruelty and without mercy's weakness and without a single boast. We did not sing when they left. We do not have a hymn for it. We only have the watch, and the watch goes on. I am not ashamed to tell you that somewhere in that long sitting I wept, and not for the Velthun. I wept for my grandmother, who had told me they did not leave because we were weak, and had not lived quite long enough to see how right she was. I wept for the ones in the deep shelters who crawled up out of the dark and laid the first lattice and swore the oath, who would never know that their fence had held against Crusade come to bless their grave. The cold did not break us. It burned off everything in us that was not patience and memory and discipline, and it left us the long oath and the deep heat and the open hand, and those turned out to be enough. We did not grow strong because we were angry. Anger burns out. Ask any old soldier. We grew strong because we remembered, and remembering is the one fire that does not go out. Every lattice under every flat on every continent was laid by a hand that remembered being left to die. Every ring in the high dark was hulled by a people who had written one line into the foundation oath of the recovery, a line every child learns before its own name. They will come back and we will be here, and we will be ready, and we will not be cruel, because cruelty is what they taught us, and we are done being their students. Sale's voice came up on the line, quiet, a little ragged at last. A young officer who had learned more in one morning than the wall, could have taught her in a career, daved. It's over. They're gone. This wave is gone, I said. You think there'll be another. There's always another. I looked out the saddle's narrow window at the high noon light on the empty mountains. The granite that hid a barracks and a power tap and a relay, the wilderness the Crusade had surveyed and logged empty and flown home from defeated. 80,000 years they remembered an earth that couldn't answer. It'll take them a while to forget what they learned today. But they'll forget. Their children will. Memory is the one thing they were never any good at, and it's the only thing we're good at. And that's the whole difference between them and us, and it always was. Then we keep the watch, Sale said. Then we keep the watch. I have run the saddle post for 11 years, and I will run it for as many more as the granite and the deep heat allow, and I do not expect to see another morning like that one. But I keep my glass clean, and I keep my array sharp, and I keep the oath the deep shelter. People swore 80,000 years ago in the dark, the oath every child on this world learns before its own name, and I will tell it to you now the way my grandmother told it to me, because it is the only ending this story has and the only one it needs. They left us to die. We did not die. We remembered. And when they come back, and they always come back, they will find us here, stronger than they are, patient as the granite, ready as the fence, and we will let them go home to tell the rest, because we were not the ones who needed to be afraid. We never were.